Alright, in this video, we are going to continue with our API application. And we've already covered the CRUD actions of our application, and that is creating a post, reading posts or an individual post, updating and deleting a post or a resource. So at this point, we don't have any authentication or authorization, but in this video, we are going to add those. So let's start by creating our auth controllers and the methods within it and our authentication routes. So in my terminal, I'm going to say make controller, let's call it auth controller. Then back to our project, I'm just going to define the functions that we need for register, log in, and log out. So let's say public function register, and let's just return a text that says register. So we are going to test these routes with these texts, and let's also accept the request since we are going to use it. Now I'm going to copy this and then paste it 2 times and just change the name to log in as well as this text. I'm going to do the same thing for the logout function. So now we have 3 functions within our auth controllers that we can use for authentication. Next, we want to define our routes. So let's open our api.php and let's just start by creating the register route. This is going to be a post request and we don't need get requests since this is just an API. So for the URI, we can say register. As a second argument, we are going to pass an array where the first element in this array is our auth controller and the second element is the name of the method or the handler for this route. So we called it register. Now I'm going to just copy and paste this 2 more times and just like the functions, change the names. So we will have one for login and one for logout. Alright, so these are our authentication routes, and if we go to our terminal and just list our routes, we can see our routes here. So 2 of them are up here and the register is down here. And we can also test these in Postman. So let's open Postman and we want to go to /register and change the method to post. So in our headers, we need to have the accept property and set the value of that to application JSON. And of course, we don't need any body at this point. So if we press send, we see the text register and we should be able to see the other routes as well. So this is login and this is logout. So our routes are set up. Now we need to go through actually registering, logging in and logging out a user. First, we want to validate the input that we get from the front-end application. So let's grab the request object and use the validate function, then apply some rules to the fields we need. So if we check our user model, we know we need a name, an email, and a password. So this is the default user model in a Laravel application. So we are going to say the name is required and the maximum value is 255. Then we want to add some rules for the email. This is also required. It needs to be a proper email and it needs to be unique in our users table within the email column. Since the name of the property and the name of the column in our users table are the same, we don't have to repeat that. Next, we need to add some rules for the password. This is again required and also confirmed. So remember, for this rule to work, we need to have another field that is the same name as this one, which is password, and then underscore confirmation. So we would need password and then another field that says password underscore confirmation. So these are our validations. Next, we want to register the user. So we can use the user model and then use the create method that would take an array with the required data. So as before, we can just save this inside a variable and then pass it down here. That would create the user for us. Then we want to save this user inside another variable so we can return it when the user is registered. So this is how we would register in a Laravel web application, and probably we would log the user in. But right now we don't have any front-end application and we just want to create a user and then also create a way of authentication. And that is where Laravel Sanctum comes in. So let's go to Laravel Sanctum documentation, and then we want to go to API token authentication. So the first thing we need to do is to make sure our user model is using this trait, has API tokens. So let's go to our application, open user model, and right here we can add has API tokens, which needs to be imported from Laravel Sanctum. So that is what we need to do in terms of preparing our user model. And back to the documentation, the next step is to issue the token. So on the user instance, we can call this method create token, which is looking for a string. This string, it could be, for example, user's name or their email, but this method will generate a random text, and that would be the user's API token. And then when it saves that token in our tokens table in the database, that would be hashed. So what we need to do when we create a token, we want to show that plain text token to the user so they can save it somewhere, or we can use it in our front-end application. So this is just like the password of a user. Only they know what's their password. What we save in our database is going to be hashed. So let's go back to our application, and right before we return this user, let's create a token for it first. I'm going to create a variable, call it token, and then grab the user and then use the create token method, which is looking for a string. So again, we can use, for example, the user name. So now we have a token that we can return alongside with this user. So instead of this return statement, I'm going to add an associative array and say user is going to be that user instance. And then we will also have a token property or key that is going to be the user's token. But if we pass the token like this, we will see an object with bunch of properties. And in fact, let's just leave it like this so we can see what we get. So let's actually register a user. We want to go to /register, make sure our header has the accept property. Then we need to add the required properties to the body of this request. So let's select raw and then JSON. Let's open curly brackets and say name, for example, John. And in fact, if we just press send like this, we should see our errors. There we go. We see email and password are required. Let's provide the email. Then we need also password, let's say 333. And again, if I send a request like this, we will see the error that the password field confirmation does not match, because we don't even have that. Because we said the password needs to be confirmed, we need a password underscore confirmation in our request. So with this information, we should be able to create a user. So let's press send. So we get our user object, and also we have a token down here. So we have our tokens with bunch of properties, and at the very bottom, we have the plain text token. So this is the user's API token that we want to expose to our front-end application, and this would be the way to authenticate users. So again, we don't need all this information. We can just return the plain text token for the user so we can use it later on. If we open our database and take a look at personal access tokens, we now have an entry where we see the ID and the name of the user and also the access token. But you notice this is not the same as this plain text token, because now this is hashed, and when we want to retrieve it, Laravel Sanctum would automatically check if the API token matches this token in our database. So that is the first step, registering a user and then issue a token for them. Next, we want to log in the user. So first, we want to validate the fields for our login function too. Let's just copy the validation rules from the register, paste it down here, then delete this name property because we don't need that. Also for the email, we don't want to say unique anymore. We could completely delete that, or we can use another rule that is exists. So it is similar to the unique rule, but this would throw an error if the provided email doesn't exist in the users table. And for the password, we just want to say it is required. And I'm also going to delete this variable. We are not going to use it. So next, we want to grab the user. Now, if we were building a web application, we would use the auth facade, and then we had the attempt method that would look for the email and the password. But again, we are building an API, so we need to grab the user using queries. So first, let's create a user here, and then we can grab the user model and then use a where method to find the user with this email. So this where method is looking for two arguments. The first one is the field we want to query. So in this case, email. And the second argument is the actual value. So we can say request email. So if this statement finds a user with this email, then it will return an array. And we want the first one in that array. So that would be a proper user object and not an array. Next, we want to check if the password is correct. So we can use an if statement, then use the hash facade, and then we have a check method available on that. The first argument for this method is the value we want to check. So we want to see if the password that the user enters in the form matches our user's password, which is coming from our database. So the first argument is the request password. The second one is user password. Now we want to check if this user doesn't exist or this password doesn't match, then show a message with the error. So we can negate this statement, but before that, we can say if the user doesn't exist or the password doesn't match, then return a message. So let's say message, and for the value, let's just say the provided credentials are incorrect and end this return statement. But if the user was found and the password was correct, we want to return the user and also issue a new token. So basically what we did up here, I'm going to copy these lines from register and just paste it down here. So we are creating a token for this user, and instead of request name, because we don't have that anymore, we can say user name. And then we are returning that user as well as the plain text token. So that is our login handler. Let's test this out. I'm going to duplicate this tab in Postman, change the URL to login, then check the headers. We have the accept property, and for the body, we need only the email and the password. So I'm going to delete the name and password confirmation. First, let's change this email and press send. We get our error message. The selected email is invalid, and that is coming from this exists rule, because we are first checking if this email exists in our database using that rule. Let's fix that and change the password to something incorrect. And let's press send again. This time we see this message. So this if statement failed, even though the user was found, but the password was not correct, and therefore we see the error message. So now if we provide the correct information and press send, we get the user object as well as the new token. And again, if we check our database, this user now has 2 tokens. So we can have multiple tokens for the same user. And basically what we want to do here in our application, issue tokens for the users when they register and log in, and delete those tokens when they log out. So let's move on to log out. And this is going to be quite simple. We just have to delete the user's token. So we just want to grab the request object and then use the user function that will give us the authenticated user. Then we have a function that is called tokens, and that will give us all the tokens for this user, and we just want to delete them. So when that is successfully done, we can return a message, and I'm going to copy this and just say you are logged out. So at the moment, this would not work. If we go to Postman and again to duplicate another tab and go to /logout and just press send, because we are not looking for anything, we get this error that we are trying to call tokens on null. And that makes sense because we don't have any way at this moment to check if the user is logged in or not. So basically, we need to protect our logout route so that it is only accessible by the logged in or the authenticated user. So again, if we go to Laravel Sanctum documentation, we have a section here protecting routes. And all we have to do is add this middleware Auth Sanctum to the routes that we want to protect. And in fact, if we go back to the API document, we already have this route that came in with the API document. And you notice this also has the middleware Sanctum on it. So I'm just going to copy this and paste for our logout route. So just by adding that middleware, if we try to make another request to log out, this time we get unauthenticated. So we get a 401, which is unauthorized, and then the message unauthenticated. So we don't get a server error anymore. So in order to tell our application that the user is logged in or authenticated, we need to provide that API token in the headers of our request. And if we go back to documentation under API token authentication, the first section here mentions that we need to include that token with the key authorization and the value that is bearer, a space, and then the token. So let's see this in practice. If we go to Authorization tab up here, then choose Bearer Token, we have a field here that is looking for our API token. So if I go back to the Login tab here and just copy this user's token and paste it here and press Send, this time we get you are logged out. And if we check our database, you notice we don't have any records because when we log out the user, we delete all their tokens. So let's log in again with the same user. Our token is now different. Let's just copy it. And of course, this is in our database now. Then go back to the logout page and replace this token. Now this time I'm going to tamper with the token. So I'm just going to add a $sign at the end and then press send. We get an authenticated. So Laravel Sanctum is automatically checking to see if this token is the same as the user's token in our database. So if I delete that $sign and press send again, it works properly. And that is basically our authentication system. So we just have to provide this middleware to any route that we want to protect from unauthenticated users. So now we have our authentication system in place. Next, we want to go back to our post controller and then adjust and protect some methods. So let's open the post controller. And the first thing I want to do is to add a relationship between post and the users, because right now there's no way we can tell a post belongs to a user. So let's start by going to the post model, and I'm going to add a public function here, call it user, and just return this belongs to a user. So using the belongs to function, we can pass the user model here. That way we define this post model belongs to a user class or a user model. And we want to do a similar thing in our user model. So I'm just going to copy this, then close this, open our user model. At the very bottom, I'm going to paste that function, change the name to posts and change the function to has many, and then change the class to post. So I'm saying this user has many posts. Now the next step is to change our post migration file. So let's open create posts table migration file, and we want to add a column for the user's ID. So let's say table, then the type of this column is going to be foreign ID. For the name of the column, we want to say user ID, and we want to say this is constrained to the ID column of our users table, and that's why we are naming it like this. And I also want to add cascade on delete. So when a user is deleted, their posts are also deleted. All right, let's save this one and close it, and close the user model as well. Then in our post controller, in the store method, instead of creating a post using the model itself, we are going to create one through a user. So I'm going to delete this first part, then grab the request object, then the authenticated user, then posts, which is the function we just created, and then we say create that post. So by doing this, we are saying that this store method is looking for an authenticated user. That means we need to protect this with that Auth Sanctum middleware. But before doing that, let's run our migrations again, because we made some changes in our database. So in the terminal, I just want to say PHP artisan migrate fresh. So this will rerun the migrations and we will end up with new tables. If we try to create a post now, we would get an error because we don't have an authenticated user. So if I go back to Postman and duplicate one of these tabs and then change the URL to /posts, and I'm going to choose no auth for authorization, so we see the correct error. And for the headers, we have the accept property. And for the body, we just want to provide the title and the body of the post. And let's just change the values to and some text. And if I press send now, we get the 500 server error instead of a proper error message, because we are trying to call a method on null. So we have to add that auth sanctum middleware to this method as well as update and destroy. Now, since we are going to add that middleware only to these three methods, we can add it inside the post controller itself. In order to do that, first we need to implement the has middleware interface, and then we need to implement the middleware function. So we can say public static function, and the name is middleware, and we want to return an array with a new middleware that needs to be imported again from controllers. And as the arguments for this middleware, we can pass the name first. So we want to apply Sanctum, and we can also add a second argument to exclude certain functions. So we want to apply this middleware to all the methods except index and show. So by doing this, if we try to send the request to make a post again without authorization or API token, this time we will get an authenticated error instead of a server error. So this is a 401 unauthorized. And now we can actually go and create a new user since we ran fresh migrations. So I'm just going to press send on this register tab, then copy this user's token, then go back to the last tab, and for the authorization, I'm going to provide that bearer token. So we can delete this one and add a new one and press send. So now we have our new post with user ID set to 1. So if we take a look at our database, we have our post, and under personal access tokens, we also have the token for this new user. And of course, under users, we have the user itself. Let's also test update and delete. Back to Postman, I'm going to duplicate this last tab, change the method to put, and then add /1 to the URL. So that is the only post we have. For the authorization, we already have this token, and that is correct. For the headers, we have the accept key, and for the body, I just want to say post1 updated. So if we tamper with the token again, for example, add an @ and press send, we get unauthenticated. But if I turn it back, which is now valid, and press send, we get post1 updated. And if we check our database again, we see that changes been applied. Let's also test the delete function. So again, I'm going to duplicate this, choose delete method, and we are going to delete post1. So of course we need to have authorization and press send. The post was deleted and it is also gone from our database. So everything is almost correct, but we have a problem here, and that is authorization. So if I create another post with the same user, so on this tab, which is used for creating a post, if I press send, we now have the same post, and in our database, we have a post with the ID of 2 that belongs to user with the ID of 1. Now, let's go back to Postman and create a new user. So I'm going to change the information here and just press send. So now we have a new user with the ID of 2, and I'm going to copy this user's API token. Then I'm going to go to the delete tab and replace this token, and also change the URL to 2 because post1 doesn't exist anymore. So what I'm trying to do to delete this user's post through another user. And so if I press send with this information, you can see the post was deleted even though this mic user was not the owner of that post. So we need to add authorization for update and delete method. We've already covered this in the Laravel series. We just have to create a policy for this. So when we created our post model in the previous video, a policy was generated for us by default. And it has several methods in it that we don't need. We only need one of them. So I'm going to delete everything here except the last method. So I don't really need the comment. I'm going to delete that too. For the name of the function, I'm going to say modify, and we are going to accept the user and the post. And instead of returning a Boolean, I'm going to return a response, which is already imported up here. So for the body of this function, we want to return a ternary operator. So we want to check if the user ID is the same as the post user ID. If that is true, we want to return a response that is allowed. Otherwise, we can deny the action using the deny function, which can take a message, and we can say you do not own this post. So again, if the user ID was the same as the post user ID, that means the action is allowed. Otherwise, we would deny the action and show this message. So now we need to use this policy in our post controller. So let's go back there, and in our update method, we can use the gate facade. So make sure you import it from facades. Then we want to use the authorize function that would look for the ability. So this is the name of the function we used in our post policy. So I called it modify, and the second argument is the arguments that our policy needs. So it's user and post. Now the user is automatically passed in. So all we have to do here is to pass down the post, and Laravel would automatically check for the user ID and the post ID. So now we want to just copy this and paste it for the destroy method as well. All right, so let's test these methods one more time. Right now we have 2 users, but we don't have any posts. So I'm going to create a post here with this API token. So that belongs to user number 1. So that means John. Now, when we registered, we used new information, and this is the API token for the second user. So it starts with number 2. Again, I'm going to copy this and go to the update tab, change this authorization token, and try to update a post. So if I go to the post tables to check the ID, it's number 3, and we want to go to /3. So with this setup right now, I should not be able to update this post because this API token belongs to Mike. However, the post belongs to John. So if I press send, we get the message, you do not own this post. Same thing should happen in the delete function. So if I change the URL to number 3 and the API token is already in place and press send, we see the same message, you do not own this post. But let's log in with John. So in our login tab, we have the information. I'm going to press send. We get a new API token that I can copy and paste it for the delete method, for example, and then press send. This time the post was deleted and it is also gone from our database. And if we check under personal access tokens, this John user now has 2 tokens. So you can read more about Laravel Sanctum in the documentation. For example, these tokens will never expire, but if you want to add a default expiration date, you can do so by going to your config folder and then sanctum.php. Right here, we have an expiration key that is set to null, and you can provide the number or the minutes until a token is expired. You can also change the prefix tokens. Right now, we have a number and then the pipe, so you can change it to a custom prefix if you want to by providing it in your env or just add it here. So as the last thing for this video, I'm going to go back to api.php, and this was the default route we had in the beginning. So it was included in this document when we installed it. I'm going to bring this back so we can use it in our front-end application later on. So let's save this document and go back to Postman, create a new tab, and just go to /API and then user, and make sure our headers has the accept property that is set to JSON. Although this is a get route, if we press send, we get unauthenticated. So if I grab one of these users API token and use it in user get route, then press send, we get the user instance. So we know that this token belongs to John. So this could be useful in our front-end application where we just want to check if the user is authenticated and what's their name. So for example, showing it in the navigation. So we are just going to leave this one in our API document. And that is our CRUD API application using Laravel 11 and Laravel Sanctum. I hope you enjoyed this video and this has been helpful. Thank you all for your support, and I'll see you at the next one.